and welcome to day 155 of Vladimir Putin's three-day conquest of Ukraine. My name is Peter Rao, and I'm joined today by three of my Hudson Institute colleagues, Mike Duran, Chan Kasapoulou, and Luke Coffey, to take another look at the war, but this time by perhaps increasing our aperture to look not just at the war as a European complex, but also through adjoining regions, in particular, the Middle East and Central Asia. I think this is in keeping with our view, or Hudson Institute's general appreciation, that the future for global power really will be decided in Eurasia, on the Eurasian landmass, when we're not shooting down spy balloons over North America and dealing with sundry problems that we, of course, have in Latin and Central America. Eurasia is, at the moment, where the action is. And so for that, I'm delighted to be joined by my three colleagues, and to start with really a military analysis on what the Iranian, in particular, participation in the war means. I'll go to Chan Kasapoulou, who's with us from Turkey today. Chan?
Hi, Peter. Thank you. Well, actually, in a nutshell, how Iran incorporated in the invasion plan so far is multifaceted, actually. The main question here is, how did Iran add any military capabilities to the Russian campaign? In order to answer that question, first of all, we have to understand that this campaign was not actually what Putin and his generals had in their minds. They planned for something like 2014 Crimea, repetition of 2014 Crimea, like a gray zone operation, not a prolonged war, definitely not a year-long war fighting. So this IPB mistake, we say intelligence preparation of the battlefield mistake, which completely miscalculated the resiliency of the Ukrainian defensive, Ukrainian territorial defense forces and Ukrainian armed forces, and also the resiliency that NATO capitals, Western capitals showed in supporting Ukraine with military means. It is not perfect, but it is definitely stronger than what Putin hoped for or predicted. So we have that year-long war. That led to depletion of Russia's missile arsenal, especially keeping in mind that advanced missiles like Caliber and advanced ballistic missiles like Iskander have really high price tags, and you cannot just unleash salvos in hundreds every day in a year-long conflict with the shape of Russian defense economics as it is today. So it was that very trouble that Iran stepped in and offered Shahed-136, Shahed-131 loitering munitions. So I'm gonna skip all the technical features here, and I will focus on one thing, the defense economics dimension, especially the unit cost of these Iranian solutions. We estimate that one typical Shahed-136 costs for about 20,000 US dollars, which is nothing compared to advanced Russian missiles. And Iran has a really robust production line, so it is able to supply Russia with thousands of loitering munitions of both kinds. So in a high-tempo operation, especially year-long warfighting occupation campaign in Ukraine territory, where Ukraine is showing really robust resilience, it is great. It is of great value for the Russian military. Not only that, we see that Tehran is being really generous with Moscow in granting co-production and technology transfer deals. The Iranians are starting a production plant in Tatarstan, for instance, in Russia, which will enable the Russians to produce thousands of Shahed-136 and Shahed-131 loitering munitions, which they renamed Geranium-1 and Geranium-2, Geran-1 and Geran-2. But it is not the full story. We are following really dangerous developments here, that the Iranian support to the Russian Federation may not be limited with loitering munitions. More advanced and traditional drones like Mohajer-6, Sageh drone, back in 2018, if you recall, it violated Israeli airspace for about 2 minutes. And in that year, in Munich Security Conference, Prime Minister Netanyahu was just showing a piece of the Sageh drone before the European strategic community to show the magnitude of the threat. That could also be incorporated in the co-production plans, along with other Iranian unmanned solutions, which is really something. We did that even once, and I concluded all the geopolitical catastrophe here with the very line of Iran is right now a drone supplier to the second largest arms exporter of the world, the Russian military, and Iran is doing it in an ongoing invasion of European territory at NATO's doorstep. So this is something. Last but not least, there is something that we haven't seen up until now, but if we come to that point, that would really be very problematic for Ukraine, because Ukraine simply lacks adequate military capabilities to fully counterbalance and tackle the threat: Iranian ballistic missiles. If Iranian ballistic missiles also make it to the Ukrainian battleground, we can see, unfortunately, more destruction, aiming at both Iranian critical infrastructure and Ukrainian critical infrastructure and Ukrainian civilian population. So far, we haven't seen that, but there is no reason to rule out the possibilities of Iranian ballistic missiles making it to the Ukrainian battleground.
Yes, John. Yeah, that's interesting because there was so much chatter about Iranian ballistic missiles some time ago, and they have yet to appear. I wonder why that is. Luke, from Iran maybe to the Caspian, I know traditionally NATO thinks of the eastern shores of the Black Sea as being the boundary, as it were, of NATO, but you've begun to think a little bit more holistically. I hate using that word, but I'll do it anyways, about a Black Sea Caspian kind of security geography. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Peter. I think that the UK Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, recently summed it up best during a meeting he had of the Dragon Group, which is a meeting that happens about once or twice a year between the head of the UK military and the Chiefs of Defence Staff of the 6 GCC countries. Last week at this meeting, he said, and I quote, "The flow of Iranian weapons to Russia's war in Ukraine demonstrates that there is no easy geographical distinction on the matters of defense." And while he was speaking to a golf audience, this very much applies to the situation in Ukraine, and especially how Russia and Iran's cozy military relationship can impact the situation with NATO and the broader region. Now, of course, since Russia's large-scale invasion a year ago, there's been this renewed focus on the Black Sea. But what is often overlooked, as you alluded to in your introduction to me, Peter, is how Russia uses the Caspian Sea to advance its war aims in Ukraine, often in coordination with Iran. The Caspian Sea is a geopolitical black hole for the U.S. and many of our NATO allies. In the latest U.S. national security strategy, in the most recent U.S. Central Asia strategy, and in NATO's most recent strategic concept, the Caspian Sea doesn't even get a mention. In the most recent posture statements from European Command and Central Command, which are the two combatant commands that share the Caspian Sea in a U.S. military sense, the two posture statements to Congress have a combined word count of more than 16,000 words. And between the two documents, the word Caspian is not found once. So there is very little of any thinking here in Washington about the Caspian Sea, or more crucially, how it's connected to Russia's war against Ukraine. I think that there are three main reasons why we have to start thinking about, at least in the context of regional security, start thinking about seeing the most extreme point of NATO's Black Sea frontier as being the southern shore of the Caspian Sea. And the first reason is the fact that one of only two canals connecting the Caspian Sea to the outside world actually connects it to the Black Sea through the Volga-Don Canal, and then into the Sea of Azov, and then onto the Black Sea. This canal is about 100 kilometers or 60 miles or so long, connecting the Volga and the Don rivers in Russia. And the primary purpose of this canal is for commercial transport. However, in recent years, it has been used more and more by Russia to transport the ships of its Caspian flotilla into the Sea of Azov and then onto the Black Sea, and also transporting military hardware munitions, and that sort of thing. And it's also been suspected that that this canal has been used to help Russia, or excuse me, to help Iran bypass economic sanctions. So Iran will, send goods through across the Caspian into this canal system and on to the outside world. Now, the bad thing for Russia is that this canal is frozen several months out of the year and it can't be used. But when it's open and when it's available, they certainly do use it. And it has played a direct role in Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine. And the Russians see this canal as being so important that even during this time of economic hardship, it was recently announced that they are investing over $1 billion to modernize this waterway. The second reason why the Caspian is important and is connected to the war in Ukraine is that Russia has used the Caspian Sea to launch cruise missiles against Ukraine. And in the past, the Russians have also used the Caspian Sea to launch cruise missiles against targets in Syria. The use of the Caspian Sea for seaborne cruise missile launches by Russia gives Moscow a strategic depth and a degree of protection that's not found in more contested regions, such as the Eastern Med or the Black Sea. And it's also worth pointing out that when Russia launches a cruise missile strike from the Caspian to a faraway place like in Ukraine, it has just as much to do with achieving a military objective in Ukraine as it does with Caspian geopolitics. The launch of these cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea sends a signal to the other countries of the Caspian that Russia is the dominant military power and they want to keep it that way. And then the final and third reason why the Caspian Sea is connected to the situation in Ukraine is over the Russian-Iranian military cooperation that Chan alluded to already. Many of the Iranian drones that are used, in fact, probably all of the Iranian drones that are used by Russia against Ukraine are transported across the Caspian and into the Volga-Don Canal onto their launch sites in Crimea or in parts of Russia near Ukraine, or they are transported by an air corridor over the Caspian for onward delivery into Belarus. The Russian and the Iranian navies conduct joint military exercises in the Caspian, and as I said, it's long been suspected that Iran has used the Caspian as a way to bypass international economic sanctions to get goods onto the international market. So those are the three reasons that why we have to start thinking, NATO planners have to start thinking that the NATO's Black Sea frontier is actually the southern shore of the Caspian Sea.
Great, Luke, although I'm certain we just lost half of our viewers when you said one of two canals, because everyone scurried to Google to figure out what the other canal is that connects the Caspian to the outside world. But
that's a topic
remarks
for another panel.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a cliffhanger, a teaser for our next Hudson Institute event. Mike Tehran, do you want to take us home in the opening round?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I thought that Luke's presentation was compelling and obviously true, but it wasn't holistic enough for me. So I want to widen the aperture a little bit more and bring in
a whole government approach.
A whole of government approach and China, which I think we need to begin to see the world begin to see the challenge, the strategic challenge for the United States is the alignment among China, Russia, and Iran. What's striking to me is that the administration has not yet admitted to itself, I think, fully. Obviously, they understand that there's a strong and growing strategic relationship between Russia and Iran, but they haven't fully absorbed all of the implications of that fact. I'm reminded, and bear with me here, Peter. I've thought this through. I'm reminded of the shift to from an Earth-centered world-centric worldview at the time of Galileo. You'll remember, and again, Peter, I've thought this through. Bear with me. You'll remember that Copernicus actually posited that the solar system, that the sun was the center of the solar system, and all the planets revolved around it. 100 years before Galileo convinced everybody that was true. And he convinced everybody that was true because he had these better telescopes, the lenses improved, and there was more and more data to track the planets and show where they were, how they were circulating. Now, in the 100 years between Copernicus and Galileo, as scientists were watching the planets rotate, they had more and more data, and they couldn't make sense of the rotations of the planets on the basis of a simple oval, because they had more and more points to plot. And so they started, in order to preserve the notion dogmatically that the Earth was the center of the universe, they started plotting these epicycles, these little loop-de-loops that the planets would do. Instead of doing a little orbit like this, they would do all these little loop-de-loops, and that allowed you to account for all of the empirical data they had. We are in, with the Biden administration, the loop-de-loop stage of the paradigm shift. They came into power in 2021 with the idea that they were going to get the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which is of course based on the assumption that China, Russia, and Iran will all agree together with the United States about how to stabilize the Middle East, about how to take care of the Iranian nuclear program. But behind that, there's a larger notion of a concert system for stabilizing the Middle East. The JCPOA cannot make sense to you unless you actually believe that the Middle East is not part of the competition between the United States and China, or between the United States and Russia and Iran, for that matter. That we can somehow agree among ourselves to take this part of the world and quarantine it from the other disagreements we have. And those are basically the assumptions that the administration is still working with in one way or another. Even if you sit down with administration officials and you talk about the links between Iran and Russia and all that they share in common, their common interest in Syria, their common interest in the Caucasus, in the South Caucasus, their common interest in Ukraine, their common interest in undermining the American order. They'll understand all of that, but their policies are still set up to treat the Ukraine question, the Middle East, or the Iranian nuclear question, the question of stability in the Middle East more broadly, the China-America competition in Taiwan, to treat all of those issues as separate, discrete arenas of conflict, each one governed by its own special set of rules. And ignoring what Luke said was that you can't have these kind of clear distinctions geographically in matters of defense. They still have not, the administration still has not responded to any of the provocations from Iran that we've seen since they came into power in 2021. Iran is enriching uranium to 60% and threatening to enrich more. It is installing and testing advanced centrifuges beyond what it is permitted by the JCPOA and the NPT. It has open plots to kill former American officials, including our Hudson colleague, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It is entered into it's not just supplying Russia, as John Kasapalou said, with drones. It's now in a co-production with the Russians to build those drones. It's going to help Russia evade sanctions, and Russia is going to help it evade sanctions for sure. Russia is going to open its procurement networks to Iran, and Iran will open its procurement networks. And those networks, by the way, as we know from the work of David Albright of the Good ISIS organization, those procurement networks go through China as well. So until the administration realizes that these issues have to be dealt with holistically, that the place to have taken care of the supply of Iranian drones Russia was actually in the Middle East, and we should start taking offensive countermeasures in the Middle East to impose costs on the Iranians so that they can't cause us trouble outside of the Middle East. Until that day comes, we're gonna find ourselves losing ground to that constellation of China, Russia, and Iran.
Not to mention that the Eastern Military District tends to be the one that Russia leans on for reserves, and they emptied that for the operation right off the bat in Ukraine, leaving their entire border with China exposed. If there wasn't at least some comfort with Beijing, that would be a notable vulnerability. But it also, I guess, the implications of what you're saying suggests that Russia has more of a reservoir of power than we might appreciate because they can lean on these other actors to sustain a war for some time. Would you agree with that?
That's to me?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, our colleague here, John Kasapoulou, in one of his recent points and recent analyses on the Hudson website, emphasized the issue of time in warfare, of time and space in warfare. We, the United States, were surprised at the difficulties that Russia had in Ukraine, and we looked at it and we saw that they were so enormous. They lost so many tanks. They lost so many men. We assumed that Putin, after having absorbed all of those blows, was going to want to cut a deal, and we were afraid of strengthening Ukraine too much because we wouldn't be able to cut a deal, and we failed. That was a failure of imagination to realize that the Russians would have reserves that they can draw on, like the relationship with the Iranians, that would buy them time to prolong the war for a whole year. Pardon me. And we now look at ourselves. We're facing a major offensive from the Russians, and it's not clear that the Ukrainians have all that it takes to stop that advance, and to force the Russians to accept a compromise that would be acceptable to the West. What Putin wants to do in the end is he wants to bleed Ukraine. He wants to turn it into a failed state. And the longer the conflict goes on, the better chance he will have of doing that. And we always find ourselves behind the curve, letting him dictate the pace, and we're reacting to him. I think we have to try to turn it around and make the Iranians and the Russians react to us. We have the power to do that, but we're afraid because I think we're afraid of escalation. But I think also there's this intellectual problem that I mentioned. We're not conceptualizing the problem correctly.
On Kasapoulou, from Galileo's telescope to your open source intelligence work, one obvious source of power to take the fight to the Russians that Mike was just alluding to has been Turkey, which has pumped a lot of material from drones to other key items into Ukraine. It's hard to talk about the earthquake without tearing up, given these images on Twitter and elsewhere that we've seen. What are the implications of the earthquake for Turkey's participation, role, support for Ukraine in the war? How do you think this will unfold in the coming weeks and months, as Turkey surely must turn inward and focus on the emergency at hand?
Thank you. That's a really specific but important one. But first of all, let me thank all my Hudson colleagues for their good thoughts and all the help with the catastrophe that we are having in Turkey, but also all Turkey's allies, all the way from the United States to Israel, our European allies as well, because they were there for us. We saw a really active search and rescue mission dispatched by all Turkish allies, including the ones that we are having bilateral issues right now, like Greece, letting everything aside and just like jumping into the catastrophe zone. I can assure you that these will not be forgotten, both on a personal level and on a national level. We see we see the power of true friendship and alliances at such times. Now, focusing on what you have asked, that's really important. In terms of the location of the earthquake, because this is a Middle Eastern, in a regional sense, earthquake. It was felt even in Israel, Jordan. It also hit Syria really hard. I think these are some issues that we have to also discuss in a separate event. It is the Russian and Iranian status quo established in Syria that is making those people suffering right now. They were equally affected by the earthquake. And because of the status quo that the Iranians and the Russians established in Syria, it is really almost impossible to bring help to those people. And also we are seeing the Ba'ath regime of Bashar al-Assad monopolizing all the international assistance. Still, this is the remnant of the policies of Hafez al-Assad, and we expect nothing different from the Ba'ath regime. But that aside, the earthquake itself did not geographically hit Turkish military production capacity, because we have most of the production capacity either in central Anatolia or in the Marmara region centered around Istanbul. So we have some here in Izmir also. The area that was affected by the earthquake is not a predominant military and defense production area in Turkey. That being said, Turkish economy will be hit for the rebuild efforts because we are seeing a catastrophic damage on the infrastructure. We are having casualties in tens of thousands, and rebuild efforts would really smash Turkish economics. I'm really sorry to say that. And also keeping in mind that Turkey going to have elections in the forthcoming months, and the election times economics is really different than business as usual. I think it might have an impact, and unfortunate and enormous impact on the Turkish economy that Turkish defense industry could scale down. But when it comes to the specific Turkish assistance to Ukraine, I mean, Bayraktar TB2 drones, I do not think Baykar company will have any shortage in the storages and in the production capacity as to supporting Ukraine. Smart munitions is made by Roketsan, and Roketsan's production facilities are intact mostly from the earthquake, and Roketsan is doing well. There are other parts of the government and the Turkish defense industry that supports Ukrainian defensive, and I think that will also carry on. And there was also the Ukrainian teams dispatched to Turkey search and rescue missions amidst the war at a time when they are really having bad times in Bakhmut East and in other parts when they are being pounded by the Russian missiles. And I think these gestures are resonating both with the Turkish society and the Turkish government. So the resilience is there to stay.
Great, thanks. Luke, you convinced me in your opening that the attacks originating from the Caspian are not just meant to impact the battlefield, but also shape the political calculations of the littoral states and the Central Asian states. So since you're sitting in Washington at a policy think tank, how would you contest that? I mean, what's the answer? How do you as the United States try to begin to work in Central Asia in a long neglected region that doesn't even mention or merit passage or merit mention in any of the strategic documents you laid out?
Well, more than 2 decades ago, in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, we were actually really engaged in this region. We even started something called the Caspian Guard Initiative, which at the time received a lot of attention and resources from CENTCOM and also EUCOM, and it also saw U.S. capabilities and U.S. platforms being delivered to the region for regional use. So, for example, around this time in 2001 to 2003, the U.S. actually delivered 3 former U.S. Coast Guard cutters to Azerbaijan. And in a twist of geopolitical irony, these Coast Guard cutters were delivered to Azerbaijan via the Volga-Don Canal that Russia is using so effectively today in its war against Ukraine. but we have to just start showing up to the region. We have very little diplomatic or high-level involvement in the Caspian region. The last Secretary of State to visit Azerbaijan was Hillary Clinton in 2012. The last time a defense secretary had visited Baku was 2010. And on the eastern shore of the Caspian, it's hardly any better. Secretary Pompeo did visit Kazakhstan in 2020, and John Kerry was the last Secretary of State to visit Turkmenistan in 2015. But the last time a U.S. Defense Secretary visited Kazakhstan was 2004, and the last time a U.S. Defense Secretary visited Turkmenistan was 2002, more than 2 decades ago. But meanwhile, their Russian and Iranian and their Chinese counterparts are always visiting these countries and building these personal relationships. Now, I think that the main strategic goal for the United States in the Caspian Sea is to help regional partners maintain a balance of power amongst all the 5 Caspian states. So the 5 Caspian states are Russia, Iran, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan. It's unrealistic to believe that a single Caspian state will ever match the firepower of Russia in the Caspian Sea, but this shouldn't be the goal. Instead, U.S. policymakers and our partners in NATO should be striving to help friendly countries in the region develop their capabilities so they can mitigate, balance, and deter both Russian and Iranian malign activity in the Caspian Sea. And ultimately, this will be in U.S. interest to do so. And with a sizable amount of Russia's Caspian flotilla devoted now to operations in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, there's this goal of balancing has probably never been more achievable. On a more tactical level, the United States should help friendly countries in the region with maritime border security, with capabilities to monitor what's happening and what's going on and like what's entering their ports to make sure no illicit goods are entering their ports. Help the regional countries, the friendly regional countries, improve their ability to protect vital energy infrastructure, to help them with their counterterrorism operations, to help ensure the free flow of legal commerce in the region, and to help them prevent the illicit transfer of weapons and drugs around the Caspian region. This can be done by helping the friendly countries of the Caspian, and by friendly, I usually consider these to be Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, help them modernize their equipment, giving them or helping them with capabilities that provide better maritime domain awareness, providing training opportunities, officer exchanges, to help them, grow a professionalized Coast Guard or maritime naval force in the Caspian Sea. Because the reality is the United States will never have a naval presence on the Caspian Sea. The last non-Caspian state to have a naval military presence on the Caspian Sea was actually the British in 1918, because of the Russian Civil War and Britain's role in all of that. And at the time, it was a ship that was actually commanded by a British general and not an admiral. It was the ship called the HMS Kruger, which was named after a former South African president that was a former enemy of the UK's. And it departed from a Persian port, flying a Serbian flag because the British general turned the Russian flag upside down, so it made it look Serbian. So he wouldn't upset any of the different conflicting parties in the Russian Civil War. So that was a very tangled web that the British had to weave in order to get a naval presence on the Caspian Sea more than a century ago. We're not going to do it today. And in fact, all the countries of the Caspian agreed that no outside power should have a military presence on the Caspian Sea. But there's a huge policy space between doing nothing at all and having U.S. naval ships on that body of water. And we need to find that middle ground. and to work either bilaterally or when and where appropriate through NATO to help willing and friendly countries in the region boost their capabilities on the maritime front.
Thanks, Luke. Let me just go to Mike, and then I'll go to John after that. Mike, I'm giving you a chance to weigh in on Central Asia, which you're welcome to do. I also want to ask, though, whether or not you think there's any breaking point at which the JCPOA framework, not just the deal as and the piece of paper, is dead, and we begin to move toward a post JCPOA world. Does that, require elections, or do you think there can be a series of events or scenarios which ultimately push the United States and its European allies, which I think are in lockstep with the Biden team on this, in a different direction?
I will. I do want to say a couple words in response to what Luke said about Central Asia, but in direct answer to your question, I know I saw before, Peter, when I made the analogy to Galileo and the Copernican revolution, I saw how excited you were by that analogy and how much it meant to you. So I want to continue with it because it was so successful. Part of the conception that the Biden administration brought to when it came into office was the idea that we are on the cusp of a transition to renewable energy, and therefore we were not going to support internationally, let alone domestically, any new fossil fuel initiatives. That was an order that was given, and as far as I can tell, the administration hasn't really departed from that. They diverted a lot of they worked to divert a lot of gas to Europe to solve the immediate shortflows to Europe, but there isn't a lot of rethinking about fossil fuels, and as a result of that, the administration wants Iranian oil on the international market. It doesn't admit that, but it does. It wants Venezuelan oil on the international market, and we know that Iran is selling record amounts of oil to China, and President Raisi of Iran was just invited by Xi Jinping for a visit to Beijing, which we should all be watching very, very closely. So when the administration thinks of, sorry,
what should we watching? What should we be watching for?
We should be watching the development of the strategic relationship between Iran and China. The Chinese irritated the Iranians when Xi Jinping went to Riyadh to develop the special relationship with Saudi Arabia, and the Iranians expressed their irritation, and I think that this is a way that Xi Jinping is moving to balance the America's Gulf partners, the growing relationship he has with them and with the Iranians. For a long time in Washington, people believed that China wouldn't be able to have such a balance because of the growing relationship with Iran. It was going to alienate the Saudis and the Emiratis and so forth. That hasn't happened. We find the relationship on both sides of the Arabian Gulf developing quickly for the Chinese, precisely because the United States is not providing the kind of security guarantees for its allies in the Gulf against the Iranian threat. So China is becoming an alternative, and not a total alternative, but is becoming a supplement. Beijing is becoming a supplemental arena in which America's allies are seeking to balance the threat from Iran. So we need to watch that closely. But to go back to Copernicus, which is really the key issue here, Peter, the administration cannot see these conflicts in a holistic fashion. but the Russians and the Iranians do. All of the things that Luke pointed out about the importance of the Caspian is absolutely crucial to the Russians and the Iranians. They understand that that if they don't hang together, they will hang separately, and that's including in Syria. There's a direct strategic connection between Crimea, the Russian naval base in Sevastopol, and the Russian position in Syria. If Ukraine, if the Ukrainians defeat the Russians and actually drive them out of Crimea, that puts an end to Russia as a Mediterranean power. It weakens its position in Syria enormously, and it also weakens the Iranians in the Iranians in Syria, because the Iranians and the Russians are in a symbiotic relationship, not a perfect alliance, but they're in a symbiotic relationship in Syria. So Russia and Iran understand that they are hanging together and that they have to work closely together, and that's why we're seeing all of this cooperation. The United States has not spent any time. When Luke tells us absolutely correctly that our strategic documents don't even mention the Caspian, what that means is that there's no one in Washington who's thinking about how do we break up, how do we break apart the Russians and the Iranians? How do we stress that relationship? The obvious way to do it is actually, Peter, Central Asia. Central Asia has some of the largest fossil fuel reserves in the world. Turkmenistan has the fourth largest gas reserves. Kazakhstan has huge oil reserves. Kazakhstan can't bring its oil across the Caspian to Azerbaijan and then on to Europe, and Turkmenistan can't bring its gas because both of them feel very pressured by China, Russia, and Iran. The counterbalance to China, Russia, and Iran in that region is Turkey. Luke is quite right. We're not going to send American forces into the Caspian, but the Turkish-Azerbaijani relationship is a very strong one. They have a very tight and growing military alliance, which proved extremely successful against Russian weaponry in the 2020 Second Karabakh War. At the time we watched that and we thought, well, the Azerbaijanis are defeating the Armenians with Turkish and Israeli weaponry, but the Armenians, yes, the Armenians have Russian weapons, but they don't really have the good stuff, and they don't have the good, or perhaps they don't have the good stuff, and perhaps they're not really trained on the Russian weaponry, or they don't have the right constellation of Russian weapons. And then suddenly we find in Ukraine, in this war, that actually the advantage that the Turks and the Turkish-Israeli Azerbaijani triangle had over the Armenians in that war was actually a strategic advantage over Russia. And what Washington should be thinking about is how to build on that triangle, Turkey, Israel, Azerbaijan, to provide security for the Kazakhs and the Turkmen to bring their resources through the middle corridor to Europe. That's a game changer, completely changes the balance of power with Russia. The only possible route to Europe from Asia, land route, goes through the only route that is not controlled by either Russia or Iran runs through Azerbaijan and then through Turkey. I do think that the Ukraine war has reminded senior officials of this fact. But again, as I say, back to my Copernican analogy, they haven't thought of it as anything more than an immediate problem about how do we get fossil fuels to Europe this winter, rather than changing structurally the whole balance. If we don't get in there with the Turks into Central Asia to develop this middle corridor, the Chinese will get in and they will shut it all down. And we're going to find ourselves, as you see this growing relationship between the Chinese and the Saudis and the Iranians and the Emiratis on the one hand, you'll see the Chinese move into Central Asia and sew up those resources, and all of a sudden we're going to wake up, and China is going to be in control of the global energy markets, and it is going to have what it already has right now. China is buying Russian oil at about 50% of the 50% of the market value of the oil. What does that mean? That means cheap industry. That means a tremendous manufacturing advantage for the Chinese economy. We're still telling ourselves that we're in an energy transition and we don't have to bust up the Russians and the Iranians. We have to get in the game, and the game is in Central Asia.
It's not just Chinese industry, it's anyone located in China. And so you have, for example, BASF, the world's biggest chemicals company, retreating from the Russian market and investing $20 billion in a new operation in China to take advantage of the cheap energy costs required in energy-intensive industries. So in a way, while I'm firmly supportive of the sanctions regime, it's the Chinese, by buying cheap oil and being allowed to proceed down that path, are in a way redirecting some FDI from Europe.
The problem with sorry, Peter, if I could just chime in there. Yeah, I mean we're driving German industry because of the cost of energy in Europe. German industry is moving to China because of the cheap manufacturing costs, and that ultimately is going to weaken the West. Where the administration is using sanctions as a kind of as a kind of cure-all, when sanctions have to be one component of a larger strategy that has to include offensive military countermeasures against Iran.
Cankasapoglu, let me go to you. If Mike Duran is correct that these actors see themselves, Russia, Iran, and China, as part of a hinge almost, or kind of a reinforcing set of challengers to the United States in our order. If the Russians and Iran, to return to the very concrete topic we began with, are increasingly in defense cooperation agreements, what can they offer one another? I mean, what do the Russians have, for example, that are going to make the Iranians better or potentially be a game changer for the Iranians? I think one metric seems obvious to me that the Iranians are offering the Russians is sheer volume of drones, for example, and helping them replenish some depleted stocks. But what's the upshot? Why is the whole greater than the sum of the parts, so to speak?
Well, all good intelligence analysis start with a good intelligence question, and that's the very intelligence question I think the West is ignoring. Because we have seen at the very outset of the war, the Iranians are coming for help with their loitering munitions, Shahed-136 and 131. Then a small number of Mohajer-6 were also transferred to the Russians. The Iranians first denied that, but the Ukrainian Navy was really quick to recover one from the Black Sea and post it on the Twitter and ask the Iranians, are you still denying that? Now, this cooperation on the Iranian supplying side can extend to Shahed-129, a Predator clone, a Sagih drone, a Sentinel clone, and most probably ballistic missiles. So this is the Iranian part. But what in return the Iranians are getting, and what could be the bad news first and the tip of the iceberg for the West? So the Iranians are getting Sukhoi-35 4.5 generation or 4++ generation fighter aircraft. What does it mean in very civilian terms? The aircraft is super maneuverable. It has really good kinematic advantages over legacy Western aircraft. So this procurement would translate into Tehran's better control over the Iranian airspace, okay? And it would not take a long time for the Russians to deliver the aircraft to the Iranians, because the aircraft are already there. They were produced for Egypt. And the Egyptians were afraid of the CAATSA sanctions countering America's adversaries through sanctions. So the package is ready, and the Iranians most probably will get their hands on the aircraft this year. Okay. So this is one dimension of the story. It would mean an enormous, unprecedented boost for the Iranian air power, which is flying with Shah-era aircraft. It is really obsolete, and it is like, if you think within the parameters of the Iranian air power, this is a really breakthrough. This is a real leap. The Iranians, I think, would marry that procurement with the underground bases. This is a really important trend that we are observing in Iran. The Iranians, with the help of the North Koreans, are transferring some of their critical military capabilities, as we conceptualize with Mike, into underground bases. Drones, loitering munitions, and missiles. In some facilities, they store them together in compliance with their concepts, operations, and doctrine, because on the battlefield, both the Iranians and their proxies are also using them. And now their defense partner, the Russians, they are using these capabilities together in a doctrinal mix in the battlefield. And we are seeing that the Iranians are mimicking the North Korean military in also establishing underground air bases. Okay, these air bases equip the aircraft and the Iranian Air Force with better protection from air strikes and missile strikes. So if you equip Tehran with a better control, with an unprecedented better control of Iranian airspace, with the Russian help, and with the North Korean help, if you give this air deterrent better protection, and also if you incorporate the timing into our strategic analysis, if you do all these at a time when Iran is moving closer to a bomb, okay, you are turning Iran into a whole different beast. But this, even the bad news that I have tried to depict up until now, could be the tip of the iceberg. Why? Because if I were, thank God I'm not, but if I were advising the Iranian regime, I would say, what do you need right now? You need an intercontinental ballistic missile deterrent, and for that intercontinental ballistic missile deterrent, you need many things, but one is an aerospace engine that would give you more than 10,000 kilometers range, so you can reach everywhere in the globe. So there are two ways that the Iranians can do that technically. One, they resort to the North Koreans for an RD-250 rocket engine, or they can just go and ask their Russian friends help. And I think their Russian friends right now are really vulnerable in returning the favor. Then the Iranians, again, if I were just doing a military advisor work for the Iranian regime, I would just recommend them to go for an advanced anti-ship missile deterrent, especially a super skimming technology, a ramjet technology. Again, in civilian terms, what it means that the Iranians would be capable of striking ships and all naval platforms really fast, and striking in a fashion that it would be hard to detect the incoming threat. The Russians can provide the Iranians with that technology. So the Western press and also Western think tanks, I'm seeing all these publications, what the Iranians are giving to the Russians and what the Iranians can give to the Russians in the forthcoming months. I think this whole equation misses one really critical intelligence question. What are they getting in return? How the Russians are returning the favor? And the Sukhoi-35, again, I'm going to repeat myself, I don't like, but I think we have to highlight that it can be just the tip of the iceberg. The Iranians have much more lucrative things in Moscow to shop for. More important, that the Sukhoi-35 procurement should be considered in the broader military strategic framework. Why the Iranians are after that aircraft at a time when they are building underground bases and at a time when they are moving closer to a bomb. Okay, so all this political, military, and geopolitical bigger picture, I think, would give us better answers to think.
Peter, sorry to interrupt, but John, can I just ask you one question that wasn't
Sure.
clear to me in your presentation?
Sure.
Why would you advise the Iranians to go for a better intercontinental ballistic missile? Why do you see that as a missing piece in their arsenal? What does it give them? What important capability does it give them that they don't have now?
That's another great one. It pertains to Iranian strategic culture, and it pertains to also military calculus as to nuclear deterrence. Okay, the Iranians, I think the Biden administration and most NATO capitals are making three mistakes. First, they are treating Iran as if it is a regional threat, a regional hostile actor. Okay, but in the Iranian strategic mindset and strategic culture, Iran is behaving like a great power. It wants to inject itself into international affairs like a great power. This is why it is developing that kind of defense cooperation with Venezuela, for instance. This is why it is supporting Russian invasion of Ukraine at NATO's doorstep. This is why Iran is injecting itself nearly in every single strategic agenda in contemporary international affairs. If you have that kind of great power aspirations, a nuclear warhead married to an intercontinental ballistic missile deterrent is the thing that would make you feel like you are in the top table of international relations, so to speak. Okay, boiling down the analysis militarily, if Iran has the warhead, I mean a nuclear bomb, but still stick to an intermediate range or medium range ballistic missile capacity, okay, it is not able to threaten continental America, continental United States. It can threaten American forward presence in the Middle East and Europe. It can threaten NATO area. But if you want to act like a great power and if you want to inject yourself into the top table of international affairs, you have to feel in terms of capabilities that you are on par with the United States, okay? And the third thing is we see the harbingers, we see the telltale indicators that the Iranians are working on that intercontinental ballistic missile program in disguise of space program, okay? Space launch vehicles, in their missile technology, especially their aerospace engines technology. And especially we are seeing the telltale indicators of Iranian defense technological and industrial base is after an ICBM with a careful assessment of Iran-North Korea strategic relations. So boiling down all the way from geostrategic and geopolitical identity and strategic culture to nuclear calculus in terms of military strategy and military science, and all the way down to defense technological and industrial base, I think we have all the indicators in place, and you have to be so naive to rule out that the Iranians are after an ICBM, because all the positive and falsifiable, provable scientific telltale indicators are suggesting so.
Thanks, John. That's fascinating. I want to assure our supporters out there that we don't ordinarily give advice to the mullahs. And if they do go for an ICBM or get the fighter aircraft, Chankasaplu will be unemployed by Hudson the next day for giving that sage advice to them. But all joking aside,
but unfortunately, if I may jump in and say something,
save yourself, John.
We are doing something though. We are giving advices to NATO capitals and to Western capitals. We are trying to explain them that you can not counterbalance an offense-dominant regime consisting of drones and missiles with defense systems, simply because, like, even if you have 90% of interception rate, 10% of penetration rate could turn you into the catastrophic situation of Ukraine right now. Odessa is getting 1 hour of electricity per day, 1 hour of electricity, and Odessa is the window of Ukraine to the world. It is the Black Sea window of the entire Ukraine, and it is getting 1 hour of electricity per day because of the drone and ballistic missile threat. We are giving advices to our allies and friends in Western capitals as to how to equip Gulf Arab nations with a counter-deterrent against the Iranian threat. And because they are not listening to us, the Chinese are snitching up all the lucrative Gulf Arab market with their drone and ballistic missile solutions. So I think it is not us, like, not giving advice. Of course, we wouldn't give Ayatollahs any kind of advice, but even the best intelligence analysis and the best advice is as valuable as it is digested by policymakers, I would say.
Oh, of course, and it just shows that Ukraine really is the center of the action. It's unleashed so much, and the world after what is almost 1 year ago now is totally different. To think that we can handle the the Iranian breakout with a piece of paper called the JCPOA seems just laughable at this point. But again, thanks to all three of you for your really brilliant insights, Sean Kasaplu, Mike Duran, and Luke Coffey. Before I let you all go, I'd like to just draw your attention at home to a new product that we're going to be putting out on a weekly basis every Wednesday, a military analysis on the war put out by Sean Kasaplu that'll give you a blow-by-blow of what's happened that week, or an interesting insight on a various or kind of specific component of the war. So I urge you to visit Hudson.org to check out that product. You can also receive it in newsletter form. You can reach Mike Duran's work at the same website. He, of course, runs our Center on Middle Eastern Peace and Security. And Luke Coffey, who is Hudson's strongman for all things from the British Isles to Afghanistan. Thanks so much for watching, and look forward to seeing you again.
Sorry, Peter. Can I just mention I'm the director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East, and I also am in charge of Hudson's Copernicus portfolio. Okay.
Likes to live in outer space, and what was it, La La Land or Loop-de-Loops, the new strategic doctrine of the Biden administration, trademarked by Mike Duran. Thanks so much. See you all next time.